it is a sad day in some respects. Nelson Mandela passed away yesterday, as I'm sure everyone is aware of now. And it's been fascinating or interesting for me, I should say, in just sort of trying to explain to my daughter who this man was. And I know, you and I are of similar age, and
men of a certain age, if you will.
Yeah, and much of at least at least to the extent that I was ever politically or first politically more aware of what's going on in the world. I mean, much of that was tied into apartheid and the apartheid movements that were pretty big, at least when I was in college. I mean, divestment was a big issue on my college campus at that time.
Yeah, my junior year in high school, Noah Schactman, who's now the editor of Foreign Policy. I don't know if you've ever had him on your show before.
I don't think so.
But you may know who he was. He used to do the Defense Tech blog, and he did the one at Wired, the Danger Room. He ran blog, and now I think he's at Foreign Policy magazine. He's an editor. He was the student body president of my high school in New York and led a walkout my junior year where we all just walked out of class. And the teachers got all pissed off and stuff because the schools, to let the schools board know that we were no longer going to tolerate being invested in apartheid South Africa. And that was probably one of the first political acts I think I ever participated in. So that was a big moment. There's no doubt that was a serious part of my consciousness politically. That would have been when the late 80s, when that occurred. And whenever you look back at these things, it's always interesting going back because we now, if you watch today, you even have Ted Cruz saying nice things about Nelson Mandela on his Facebook page. Read the comments though for fun.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing is that you still see that right wing invective. Not so much from the right-wing leaders, although there are some. We have a clip we'll play of Bill O'Reilly and Rick Santorum soon. But it's fascinating. I mean, there are two things that are going on. One is sort of an ignoring of Nelson Mandela's broader agenda for justice.
That's right.
He was not merely a civil rights leader. I mean, he was someone who fought literally for economic justice. I mean, people forget that he came out
justice and peace.
Yes, he came out strongly against the Iraq War. And you can still see the writings of right wingers as late as 2003 completely disregarding this man. And I was saying in the intro of the show that there's plenty of opportunities for people to hear of this guy's legacy. But I think it's important to go back and also look at, where the right was on apartheid as late as the 80s.
And yes, the mid-late, when they had the Anti-Apartheid Act in 86, I forget the name of the bill, that was to strengthen sanctions and to declare that Mandela, who had already been in prison at that point, I think, for 23 years, should be released from prison. You had Ronald Reagan, of course, opposed that.
He vetoed the bill.
Government.
He vetoed it.
He vetoed the bill. It had to be he had to be overridden, if that's a word. They had to override him. And one of the, I wouldn't quite call him a young, let's call him a middle-aged congressman from Wyoming named Dick Cheney, of course, supported Reagan on that and voted against the bill numerous occasions and called Mandela a terrorist and called the ANC a terrorist organization and supported apartheid South Africa. So it's always good to have, same thing with Margaret Thatcher in England. It's always good to have this history because as we've learned recently, And we've learned this throughout history, but it's just been apparent recently because we just had the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination. We just had the 50th anniversary earlier this year, of the I Have a Dream speech. And what the right loves to do is, at the time anybody is standing up for radical social change and looking at the existing order and questioning it, critiquing it, they will do anything to discredit the people doing it, calling them anything from communists to traitors to whatever it might be, and also, of course, in some cases, killing them. But it's amazing how later they always claim them for their own. Now Martin Luther King would have been a Republican. John F. Kennedy was really conservative because he cut the tax rates at the time from which were 91% all the way down to 70%, not 29%, in an act of Keynesianism, not supply-side economics. And they're doing this, Rosa Parks ended all racism,
right?
Or RNC, or there was the National Republican Senatorial Committee. One of them, tweeted out. So now they love her, even though at the time, God knows what what people on the right were saying about her at the time. And this is a pattern that the right is always on the wrong side of history. Very literally, you can sit there and every single time they will be on the wrong side of history. They will attack people on the right side of history, and then they'll find a way to whitewash it 20, 30, 40, 50 years later. I mean, hell, even right now, they're busy saying, a lot of them are praising Bill Clinton to attack Obama,
right,
the guy they impeached. I mean, you literally, it's predictable. As in 10 or 20 years, they'll be saying how great Obama was to discredit President Elizabeth Warren or Sherrod Brown or whoever comes.
I'm not so convinced of that. And I think there may be a slightly different dynamic at play when it comes to Obama. But that's certainly.
I don't know. Nothing they're saying now is worse about Obama
right.
than what they said about Kennedy or what they said about Martin Luther King or what they said about Mandela. Nothing's worse. I mean, those guys were all terrorists. Those guys were all communist dupes. Those guys were all were traitors to the United States or to their own country. I mean, we'll see. I'm just saying, don't put it past them to do that. To look back at Obama fondly.
Just a couple of quotes that we've dug up. Back in 1985, William Buckley wrote that the release of Mandela may one day be likened to the arrival of Lenin at the Finland station in 1917. And this, of course, is where Lenin returned to Russia from exile in Switzerland ahead of the October Revolution in Russia. I mean, this is Buckley went on to say that it continued to sort of demonize Mandela. And, the reality is that Mandela did start his career engaging in violence. He was, of course, part of the ANC, which engaged in violence. But he was fighting back against a incredibly violent, oppressive regime.
And there were African Americans and others in the South in 1840s that engaged in violence, and there were Jews in Germany in the 19. I mean, I guess it's always the whole thing about one man's terrorist, isn't it? I mean, it really depends. But Martin Luther King had his, and Gandhi had their views on violence. And my view is, violence should be the last resort. But there are times when violence is required, and when a group of people are systematically torturing, murdering, dehumanizing, terrorizing, imprisoning, and doing the rest of what they were doing in South Africa, that, to me, fighting back against that does not make that a terrorist act. It makes it a just act that was required.
And it also, I think, Peter Beinart had a pretty good piece on this, too, that Mandela was seen, and the ANC was seen exclusively in the prism of the Cold War, and he made the point that there are times where I don't have the piece right in front of me, but he made the point that that there are times when the United States has been on the right side of freedom, and been times where it's been on the wrong side of freedom. That America's agenda is not necessarily always consistent and aligned with the notion of freedom.
No, and quite frankly, for much of the 20th century, in many places, we got it wrong. You know, we involved ourselves in Central and South America in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I mean, a lot of the blowback in Iran can be traced to what we did in overthrowing their leader in 53, 54. I mean, you know, we were doing lots of bad things in lots of places. Not to say that America hasn't done many good things too. It's to say that, you know, we were doing, you know, these types of things, and as you pointed out, particularly in the post World War II world, it really came down to the kind of formulation that President George W. Bush would put together. You're either with us or you're against us. And so, quite frankly, anybody who had the slightest sympathies towards helping their people, socializing some of the industries that have been destroyed, you know, basically raping their people financially, that was it. You know, I mean, there still are many historians that will argue that we pushed Castro into the communist embrace. Right. Certainly, he was going to be a socialist of some sort, but we pushed him into a very different place than where he was going to be because we didn't even try to reason with him or talk to him. Sound familiar with what goes on with the guys who don't want to talk to Iran today or any of these countries? We just tried to kill him. You know, I mean, and we supported Batista, who was a murderous dictator, and you can find many others like Somoza and throughout the Americas and throughout, you know, Africa and other. So, yes, Nelson Mandela got caught up in that. He actually wanted to help his people. He saw that there had been people that had been systematically injuring his people, and for that, he had to be a communist, the way Martin Luther King had to be a communist here for making a pretty similar argument.
Right. Right, and you know, it really is though. I mean, the story of his life, to have spent 27 years in prison, more than half of those in just an ungodly, brutal prison, and to come out and have the ability to reconcile both. I mean, to basically swallow the urge for revenge, and it's just incredibly impressive. I mean,
that to me is the most amazing part of his story, and why he stands out the way he does. I mean, there are a lot of amazing things about him, but to me, that is the most amazing part because he's a better person than I am. I can say very clearly because I don't think I could have done that, and I think a lot of people couldn't have done that. And the sad thing is, what happens is, you get into these cycles of violence. You know, you see what happens when, let's say, you know, the former Yugoslavia loses its strongman, loses Tito, and then all the ancient animosities come out. I mean, people are looking back as far ago as like 700 years before to justify killing people that look different or speak differently or worship differently. And here's this guy, you know, there hadn't been hundreds of years, hadn't been decades. He literally just, you know, got out of jail and said that we need to set up a representative government, and we're going to include everybody. We're going to include the people that literally were torturing me last week. That's amazing.
Yes.
To me, that is absolutely amazing. It is something that I think very few people on this earth could do.
It is. I mean, it really genuinely was. I mean, it's been interesting. I mean, I've just been spending time thinking about that era, particularly of the late '80s, and thinking back to sort of how marginalized too those who were pushing for divestiture, and who even by elements in the sort of the liberal moderate camp, I think, we should also note that. And not every situation is analogous, both in terms of the efficacy of tactics, but there was a lot of people who said at that time, and I say this with the notion that sanctions don't always work, but for the South Afrikaner government that perceived itself as, in many ways, sort of like part of the Western world, I guess. The sanctions, even things like the boycotting and the disallowing of their sport, of them to sort of engage in sports, in an international way really ultimately had a tremendous effect, I think.
I'm sorry, I lost you for a second.
I was just saying that the notion of divestiture and of boycott, where, there was a lot of people, I think, at the time who were saying, the watchwords were like the Sullivan principles, which were really more in many respects about constructive engagement, I think was also the way that they talked about it. And things like boycotting and banning South African sports teams from playing and engaging in international sports. These things, which were often poo-pooed by the technocratic center, really, I think, had a tremendous effect. And part of that
is a great point. It's a fantastic point. It's a sort of a great description of why the so-called centrist groups like Third Way don't understand what they're doing. I'm sure you've already talked about that.
Yeah, well, I want to turn to that actually, but in a moment. But I just, there are times where sanctions really does punish the people of a country, and is ultimately serves more to to sort of rile up domestic support for a more antagonistic perspective towards countries. And there are also times where these type of movements, even if they are not sanctioned by the government, have impact. And, I think, I'm thinking in terms of like the BDS movement against Israeli products, and in terms of creating some force for change. The dynamics are very different when you're talking about a country that perceives itself as part of sort of the Western world, as part of sort of an extended Europe. And I think, there's a lot to be learned there, I think, from that. But
right. Oh, and not all boycotts are, and divestiture and the rest are equal. There are. Obviously, it's and sanctions. Quite frankly, it's how you choose to set up sanctions, what you choose to target. A lot of this is strategic. A lot of this is in who you're hurting in the process and the message you're sending forth. I mean, it's too much to go into in sort of one conversation here. But that was a case, obviously, with South Africa, where sanctions were quite necessary, and there was something that played an important role. It played an important role in bringing together, much of the world to condemn what was going on there. Just as Martin Luther King's domestic boycotts played an important role here. So, you had that one thing everybody has is economic buying power. You get to decide where you're going to go and spend your dollars, and, you have a say in where your government does, at least theoretically. And that is an important way that change can be brought about if done in the right way. Look, I'm part of groups right now that are pushing all sorts of hedge funds and others to divest from the firearms industry.
Yeah, and I think part of that is not just a question of economics, straight economics. It's also a question of shame.